Good afternoon. Welcome to the AHDB Beef and Lamb Beef Teleconference call today. We'll be starting in a few moments, and our speaker today is Andy Forbes. The conference call will be recorded, so that if you wish to come back to it at any stage and listen to the call again, you can do so via the Better Returns Programme pages on our website. Just to remind people that if you have a burning question or a question you want to ask Andy during the course of the call, if you email that to brpconf@ahdb.org.uk, I can see your questions as they come in, and I will relay those to Andy as the chairman of the conference. Alternatively, if it's easy for you, you can text me on 07973 701 211. So if you want to text a question, text it to 07973 701 211. Or email your questions into brpconf@ahdb.org.uk. So this afternoon's conference is looking at the issue of parasites in cattle, internal parasites, and there's a little bit on external as well, and some of the treatment options we've got. If you want to look at our own material, I'll repeat this later in the call, but if you go to beefandlamb.ahdb.org.uk, the Better Returns Programme pages, under Health and Fertility, you'll find the Controlling Worms and Liver Fluke manual, which is based on the COWS principles, Control of Worms Sustainably. Or if you want to actually see a lot of what Andy's talking about is based on COWS principles, and you can find the full Monty technical publication, technical manual for vets, is on the cattleparasites.org.uk site. So lots of places to direct you to there. I'll repeat those reference sources later during the call. The way it'll work this afternoon, we'll go live with Andy in just a moment. We've only got one speaker this afternoon, but he's got a large topic to cover. So what we're going to do is Andy's going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes on the target parasites and seasonal challenges that they present us in cattle. We'll take a break, take some questions at that stage. So if you've got them, email or text them through to me. And then we'll go on later on the second half of the call to look at the actual sort of treatment options and strategies for managing parasites in cattle. So just to remind you again, if you've got a question, email it to brpconf@ahdb.org.uk or text me on 07973 701 211. So we're at the allotted time to start the conference call, so I think let's kick off. I'll hand over to Andy Forbes, who is a trained vet. I've known Andy for many years. He trained as a vet and did some practice for a few years before going into industry, where his focus remained on animal health. In later years, he's gained a PhD. He's remained his focus on cattle parasite and endemic diseases, and he's currently a lecturer at Glasgow University and an independent consultant, and is very involved in the COWS group, the COWS initiative, which is Control of Worms Sustainably, which makes him the perfect speaker for our presentation this afternoon looking at cattle parasites. Andy, I'll hand over to you.
Good. Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. It seems a bit incongruous to be talking about parasites during the winter and at housing when we're just in the throes of another little bit of an Indian summer. And indeed, yesterday, taking the dog for a walk, just as a reminder, one of our neighbours' sheep had fly strike. So certainly the summer parasites have not finished with us yet. So that's just a sort of a lead-in to the subject which we're going to talk about this afternoon. But nevertheless, in cattle housing, and I guess the majority of cattle are housed these days, does provide a really good opportunity to get on top of some of the common parasites of cattle, in fact, most of the common parasites of cattle, for various reasons. For example, all the common and most important worms of cattle, that's the stomach worms, the lungworm and the liver fluke, are all acquired while cattle are grazing on pastures over the spring, summer and autumn. But clearly, once they've been housed and they're being fed on conserved forages and other foodstuffs, the chances of them getting new infections are virtually zero. And therefore it means that they've got a clean break from new infections, and effective treatment at that time can essentially make sure they get through the whole of the winter without being bothered by these parasites. And at the same time, it also means that any cattle which are being retained and going to grazing for the year afterwards will not be contaminating the pastures with eggs or larvae in the dung from these animals if they've been effectively treated. So there are two very good reasons for thinking about treating cattle at housing. And the other thing, of course, is that although, in contrast, the common external parasites, that's to say lice and mange mites, are very or rarely seen during the summer months, once the winter arrives, the cattle become more closely confined, the coats grow longer, and the lice proliferate, and they start to breed more actively, and this is why we commonly get lice problems, for example, after Christmas up into January, February, when the populations are built up. So once again, it's a slightly different rationale, but it's also, housing also represents a time to try and get on top of the lice before they get on top of the cattle. Just a few words about some of the sort of seasonal aspects and of these conditions. By and large, if we think about the gutworms, depending a little bit obviously on the control you've been using through the grazing season, plus anything in terms of pasture management, but overall the greatest risks from gutworms typically comes from about mid-July onwards, and the risk remains high thereafter. As I say, that the actual level of risk depending on how much control you've done in the early part of the year. But it does mean that cattle are certainly still picking up stomach worms from pasture as we speak, and will continue to do so up until housing. And in a similar way, liver fluke are also quite predominant at this time of year. The life cycle is a little bit different from the stomach worms and involves, as I'm sure most of you know, a mud snail, but nevertheless, these snails reproduce, and they also, the infected ones, produce the sort of juvenile fluke. And again, the high risk time for liver fluke of acquiring new infections is from late summer, early autumn onwards up until housing. So this is a peak time when cattle will be exposed to liver fluke if they're grazing pastures which have the snails, which tend to be the kind of rougher, rushy sort of pastures anywhere which has got some damp mud and conditions around. Lungworm is a bit of a law unto itself, and it can be seen at any time of year, but at this time of year it's equally likely to appear. And the one bit of sort of warning, if you like, for those of you who have experienced some dry conditions this year during the summer, is that both the larvae of lungworm and of the gutworms may remain inside dung pats which have dried out over the dry period, and then once you get some rainfall in the autumn, the rainfall softens the pat, and the larvae are able to escape from the pat onto the pasture and therefore constitute a risk. And this can be quite a high risk because you've got an accumulation of larvae from several weeks over the dry period. So that's just a warning that if you have had dry weather, once the wet weather comes, that you can have quite a high risk of both lungworm and of gutworms. Now, the conditions that they cause in general, but over winter in particular, if we look first of all at the stomach worms, they result in pathology and damage to the lining of the fourth stomach, the abomasum, and that in itself can cause loss of appetite and ill thrift and generally poor use of feedstuffs. There's another phenomenon with the stomach worm, which is unfortunately doesn't have a common name, but it's a well-described syndrome where some of the larvae, instead of developing straight away into adults within about 3 weeks, which is the normal time period, they remain dormant, sort of hibernating in the stomach wall, and then they don't emerge until the late winter, early spring. And when they do emerge, if the animals are heavily infected, this can result in quite a severe scour condition, which can even be fatal. Not usually in all animals, but in a small proportion of animals which haven't had an effective treatment at housing. So that's just a thing to be aware of, because, as I say, it's not that common nowadays, because most people do use housing treatments, but if you don't use an effective housing treatment, that is a potential threat. Otherwise, with liver fluke, the pattern of liver fluke and the risk, the magnitude of the risk in the autumn, is quite largely dependent on the summer rainfall. And the snails are amphibious snails. They need water to reproduce, to feed, and hence you can get some idea. You can actually sort of forecast the risk of liver fluke in the autumn by looking at the rainfall during sort of May, June, July, because that's the critical time when, if the snails are infected, when they will, as I say, proliferate, and loads of the intermediate stages of fluke will be passed on to the pasture where they can be grazed by cattle. So that's depending on where you are in the country, that may be a consideration as to how high the risk of liver fluke is this year, or indeed any year. The damage caused by fluke, I guess, is quite well known. Ill thrift will be one of the dominant signs. The liver fluke, the adult liver fluke, they suck blood, and that's essentially how they cause harm to the animals. They're quite prolific in sucking blood, and they can cause anemia, which is loss of blood, and recognizable in the animal by, if you look at its eyes, you can see a very pale membranes, and also they sometimes get bottle jaw too. So those are the sort of two of the common signs in cattle, but there are also more subtle signs, including they interfere with the immune system, which can have knock-on effects onto other infections, particularly bacterial infections like tuberculosis. So liver fluke is a very important parasite to control. And another close relative of the liver fluke, which has come to prominence in the last few years, is a parasite called the Rumen Fluke, and it, as its name would imply, lives inside the rumen. In fact, the Rumen Fluke is not thought to be too damaging to the animal, but there is, nevertheless, it has its early part of its life cycle takes place in the duodenum, which is the sort of upper part of the small intestine, and can cause damage there. And then in severe infections, that can indeed cause clinical illness in particularly in young cattle, usually with similar signs to gut worms. That's to say, scouring and rapid loss of condition and dehydration. So although that particular manifestation is not particularly common at the moment, it's certainly something to keep your eye out, especially if you have cattle which are not responding to conventional treatments in the autumn. So overall, the impact of these parasites, these worm parasites, naturally, as you can probably judge, affects overall performance. I mean, they aren't often fatal, these infections. They can be, but they're not often. It's more just a question of poor growth rates in younger animals and poor carcass quality. And even in adult cattle, it can always also cause some ill thrift, some decline in milk yield, occasionally effects on fertility. And do remember, too, that, for example, with the liver fluke, there is no immunity to liver fluke, so cattle of all ages can be affected. It's slightly different with gut worms, where generally speaking, older animals are more immune to them, but nevertheless they can still experience some small production losses. The lungworm, on the other hand, is potentially a very serious disease, parasite. Clearly, these worms can be about 3 to 5 centimeters long. They occupy the main airways in the lung, and it's fairly clear that you don't have to have too many lungworms before breathing becomes very difficult, and indeed these can be fatal infections, and they can also affect cattle of all ages. So it is very important that people are extremely vigilant for lungworm, as I say, in the autumn when they may be at risk from infections that have accumulated earlier on, but also in the context of housing. Animals with lungs damaged by lungworm are more susceptible, generally speaking, to the other more common, you might say, caused of pneumonia in house cattle like bacteria and viruses. So there's another reason why it's very advisable to exercise some control of lungworm when the animals are housed. I did mention also that the fact that it can be useful to try and ensure that animals are clear of parasites so that they don't transmit any the following year when they go out to grass, and that applies particularly to lungworm and liver fluke. So effective treatments for lungworm and liver fluke during the winter can mean that they go out and they don't immediately contaminate the pasture. And the final group I want to talk about in this opening session are the external parasites. Now, these are the most common ones that occur during the winter are lice and mange mites. Lice are probably the most common. In their own right, they don't necessarily cause very dramatic clinical signs. It may be just a question of rubbing and hair loss and sometimes some poor condition, although some lice also suck blood, and by doing so, they again can make the animals anemic, and occasionally even there have been some fatal cases described, but that's unusual. But they certainly can cause scratching and cattle looking in poor condition. The other thing about lice is they are quite a common cause of poor leather quality, which doesn't necessarily affect farmers directly because they're not paid essentially for the hides, but the leather industry does have to reject as first quality leather hides which have been damaged by lice infections over winter. So that's another reason, if you like, if you want to be kind to the leather industry, to try and keep on top of these parasites. The mange mites that again is a winter condition predominantly. There are two common types of mange in cattle, and one less common but more severe and more difficult to treat. Again, the clinical signs are usually loss of hair and some sort of crusty lesions, quite often around the tail head or the back of the animal, and they cause behavioral changes, scratching and stuff like that, which in turn affects performance and production. And so they can be, again, an important cause of poor health, ill health in house cattle. So overall, the impact of these parasites individually and collectively really justifies using a housing treatment as a means to try and make the animals survive and thrive during the winter, and as I said, also to try and prevent the cycling of disease agents through into the following year. So at that stage, I'd like to just stop this first session, which is just a general description of some of the patterns and the impact of parasites, and take any questions on that bit, and then we'll move on to the actual treatment at housing.
Great, thanks, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. Andy, thanks very much. Just to remind everybody on the call, if you want to ask a question to Andy, please email that to brpconf@ahdb.org.uk or text me on 07973 701 211. Andy's provided some notes to go with his presentation, which we call the Expert View. You can find those on the website after the conference call, or you can request one by email, again on the BRP Conf email address. Andy, just picking up on a point there you mentioned about stomach worms and this sort of unique behaviour where they almost lie dormant before then progressing into the adult stage and causing problems later in winter. Presumably, if you did a housing treatment that deals with that problem so that they don't go into that mature phase. Is that correct? Did I understand that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And as I say, this condition has arguably become less common because a lot of farmers do treat cattle at housing. The proviso is, and we'll cover it in the next session, is that not all of the anthelmintics are equally effective against these inhibited larvae. They are generally more difficult to kill, if you like, than the adult worms, for example. So you do have to be careful about the choice of anthelmintic which you use at housing. Okay.
We've had a question in about fecal egg counting. We hear a lot about the use of fecal egg counting in sheep worm control strategies in terms of targeting treatments and so on. Andy, what's your thoughts on fecal egg counts in cattle? Are they worth it?
Well, the situation in cattle is not dissimilar, in fact, to sheep or even horses to some extent. I mean, fecal egg counts do have a role to play in generally managing and monitoring parasite infections. The limitation, though, and this applies to all of them, but particularly in cattle, is that they don't have a strong relationship at all with things like growth rates, for example, or the degree of damage to the stomach, for example, in terms of the gut worms. So they do have some limitations, and my view is that they should never be used in isolation to decide whether you need to treat or not. They should be used in conjunction with other measurements. And in young cattle, for example, it's been shown in several studies that actually just monitoring live weight gain against target is one of the best ways of monitoring the need for treatment or not, particularly in young grazing cattle in their first season. Obviously, that's assuming that they've got sufficient food and that there's no other, obvious disease or other cause of ill health. Having said that, I guess that's what you're aiming at for the other parasites, for lungworm, where you're looking for larvae, and for liver fluke, where you're looking for liver fluke eggs in the dung. Those are both very useful because in those cases, you are just interested really in whether the parasites are present or absent. That can be important information by itself. Whereas with gut worms, all cattle have gut worms if they're grazed. So it's not a question of have they got worms, it's a question of have they got worms that are doing them any damage, and that's a different question altogether. Okay,
so if a producer was concerned about their cattle's exposure to liver fluke or potentially lungworm, a fecal egg count or an analysis to see whether there is a presence there is a good indicator, but for the more general worms, perhaps less useful.
Yep, that's correct. And just one quick aside too with the liver fluke and the lungworm is that obviously it's only the adult parasites which produce eggs or larvae. So and it does happen sometimes with liver fluke, for example, you get infections where the fluke has not yet developed into an adult. Obviously, you won't get any eggs in the dung in those cases.
We've had a question in on liver fluke. You mentioned earlier on in your presentation about sort of the seasonal variances. For many people in the country, it's been a relatively dry summer. Does that lure us into a false sense of hope that we won't have exposed our animals to liver fluke? And if so, the slightly trickier question is, how do I know as a producer that my cattle may have liver fluke and that I need to react to that?
Yeah, I think with fluke is a little bit different from the gut and stomach worms, which I described earlier, where you can get a false sense of security because the dry season, you might think, well, nothing much is happening, but actually they're all just sitting inside the dung pats waiting to come out when the rain returns. In contrast with liver fluke, there have been quite well-established forecasting mechanisms which have been used, and they are based very much on that rainfall over the middle part of the summer, the middle months, May, June, July. And so if it is dry over those months, then that will effectively reduce the risk of liver fluke because the snails do require moisture, as I say, to breed and to feed, and also for the fluke intermediate stage to get from the dung to the snail, from the snail onto the grass, which they have to do during part of the life cycle, they also need moisture. So if you haven't got those moist conditions, then genuinely the fluke risk should be reduced in that year.
And just to summarise again, Andy, so in terms of liver fluke, trying to observe or consider what risk you've got, or in presence of liver fluke, just run through again what those sort of things are that we should be looking for.
Well, I think first and foremost, I guess most farms may already know if they've got liver fluke, and as I say, if you've got the snail needs damp, muddy areas with just shallow water to breed, and I guess most farms have that, some more than others, and some fields, for example, where rushes grow is a very good indicator that those are suitable for liver fluke snails. In terms of monitoring, obviously, if you do have cattle going to slaughter, nowadays, well, in fact, they've always known, but there's perhaps more attention paid to it now. You can get feedback from the abattoir, which can give you some idea of what's going on, how much liver damage you're seeing, how many live flukes they might be seeing in those animals, and that's a very good way of monitoring things. You can take fecal samples, as I said, just to check for the presence of adult fluke. And there are one or two other tests which probably wouldn't be done routinely, but which your vet can advise you about in terms of looking at the liver function, and also there's another test you can do on the dung called a copper antigen, which detects infections when they're a bit less mature, so in other words, before they produce eggs. So those would be the kind of things. Plus anemia, if you're actually handling the animals, if you look at the eyes and just see whether they look pale or whether they look at a nice sort of salmon pink, which is the normal colour.
In the eyelid?
Yeah, in the conjunctiva, the pink bit just around the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that kind of clears the questions that we've had in so far. Just to remind people, if you've got a question or something pops into your mind, email it to brpconf@ahdb.org.uk or text me on 07973 701 211. Andy, I think we'll go on to the treatment section. Now you've told us about these nasty beasties that are out there, how do we treat them all?
Right. Well, just to reiterate, as we said in the introduction, housing or during housing is a very good time to treat for most of these parasites, because the worms are no longer being ingested by and large, and the external parasites are finding conditions more to their liking. So in terms, of the target, or the objectives, if you like, of treatment and the target parasites, what you're trying to do is allow cattle to get through the winter on your, what may be quite expensive feed, without any negative effects of parasites. You're trying to avoid this disease caused by stomach worms which have gone into hibernation, because if you treat effectively at housing, that you should get rid of that risk. You're treating for lungworm to try and improve the health of the lungs, so they're more able to fight off other pneumonia bugs which they can get inside. And you're also trying to stop those animals from producing eggs and larvae which can go out onto the pasture the following year. And equally, a treatment at housing with an effective ectoparasiticide, something which kills lice or mange, will prevent those populations from increasing, and therefore you shouldn't get lice and mange problems later on in the winter when they would normally occur. Now that's all the principles. The practice of it is, well, it's relatively straightforward, but having said that, there are always choice in these, and in terms of the choice of the product, of course, there's a lot of things which need to be taken into consideration. I guess first and foremost is the actual spectrum of activity. So in other words, does the product you're using, does it kill liver fluke? Does it kill young liver fluke or old liver fluke? Does it kill lice, or does it kill mange? Does it kill stomach worms? All those kind of things. So you obviously, first things first, you've got to choose products which are going to kill the parasites which you're most concerned about. Secondarily, there are other components like the administration method. Some of these products, for example, are only available as drenches, and some farmers have a preferences for injections or pour-ons, especially in bigger cattle. But on the other hand, there are some times you haven't got too many options, and drenches are probably the best products to go with. Any beef animal which is destined to go to the abattoir at some stage, particularly if it's going to be put away during the winter, you need to look at meat withholding periods and make sure that you're not going to jeopardize them in that. Well, I won't mention the very obvious other one, of course, is cost, which is always going to be part of the equation, I guess, but hopefully shouldn't be limiting in making the correct choice. Just by way, the sources of information about these things, you can obviously look yourself. There are all sorts of online sources, of which the AHDB, Beef and Sheep, of course, is one. They produce a very good parasite control guide each year, which I heartily recommend. I'm not being commercial, I'm just saying it's a very good source of information. Not only does it give basic properties and efficacy and withholding periods of the products, but most importantly, it gives all the trade names, because there's a limited number of chemicals are used in these control products, but a huge variety of different trade names. So if you want to know exactly which one contains what, you really need to have some source of reference. And naturally, the other sources should be your vet or your SQP at your store would be other reliable sources of information about what products might be the best to use. So that's the sort of the general background. If we get into the specifics, and we'll start with lungworm. Now, any of the normal, common, if you like, wormers of cattle will kill lungworm. And because you're treating at housing, things like persistent activity, which is an advantage if you're treating it, normally speaking, if you're treating animals at grass to stop reinfection, at housing that isn't so important. So in essence, any of the products from all the major groups can be used to control lungworm. If it's just lungworm you're trying to treat, but obviously that's not usually the case. But just to briefly summarize that, and again, I will try and use words that are familiar, but there are a group of compounds which have various names, the avermectins or the macrocyclic lactones or MLs, and these include products like Ivermec, Epronex, Dectomax, Cydectin. Any of those are very, very effective against lungworm. Then you have the so-called white drenches, things like Panicure, given as straight oral drenches, and they also are effective against lungworm. And then you've got those containing a drug called levamisole, things like Leverside, and they also control lungworm. So in essence, lungworm is relatively easy, and it probably isn't the parasite which defines or determines your choice of anthelmintic to use. If we move down to the gutworms, here the choice is exactly the same. All those different, there's three main groups and a number of different products within each of those three groups. But here, because we're trying to prevent this inhibited stomach worm, the choice is narrower. In this case, the best efficacy is with the ML, so that's the Ivermec Dectomax type product. The white drenches have variable activity, and it is very variable, so that they're not 100% reliable in terms of treating this, and the levamisole products are ineffective against inhibited larvae. In fact, they don't really have much effect on the ordinary larvae of the stomach worm. So on that basis, if this is a target parasite, then you would certainly probably go for an ML or possibly a benzimidazole. But as I say, the levamisole is an area which it's not their strong point, so that they would not be recommended for that. With flukicides, it gets a little bit more complicated, at least we make it complicated anyway, because the flukicides have different types of activity. That is to say, some of the compounds only kill the adult fluke, which are, when they're in the bile ducts, when they're about sort of up to about or 12 weeks of age and older. There's a couple of products which include things like Trodax and closamectin, which will treat liver fluke from about 8 weeks of age onwards. So they're sort of juvenile and not quite adult, but they don't kill all the juvenile stages. And then there's only one flukicide which kills liver fluke at a very young age of about 2 weeks of age or so, and it's a drug called triclobendazole. So the sort of original product containing that was Fastnex, and that's given as a drench. There is one drawback which unfortunately has become apparent, is that there is some resistance to triclobendazole in this country now. So caution, a little bit of caution required, and again, probably the best person to check with is your vet to see whether there's any reports of that in your area. If not, it's probably perfectly fine to use it. But if there is any resistance, you might have to just check or possibly use another product. But you can always do some sort of checks and see whether the treatments are working. And with the flukicides, there are sort of two main objectives of treatment, which fall into the generality which we talked about earlier. One is to allow good live weight gain, and the other is to suppress or in fact eliminate the passage of fluke eggs in the dung for any animals that are going to remain on the farm and go out to to grass the following year. If you're treating animals which are going to be going to the abattoir and not going to go to graze, it's not quite so critical. In fact, a recent study has shown that, in fact, you can treat with virtually, well, essentially any of the main types of flukicides at or around housing, and you can get good growth rates with all the treatments. And so that might make the choice a little bit easier for anything that's going in. There may be some exceptions to that rule. This was one study. One study doesn't mean it's going to be the same for every farm. If they've been very heavily infected before they are housed with juvenile fluke, they may need a second treatment. But that can be monitored during the housing period, either by weighing them and just checking whether they're still growing according to your objectives, or you can take fecal samples, and you can actually do what's called a bulk fecal sample. So just take samples from 10 animals and put them all in the same bag, and then they can be examined in the lab to see whether fluke eggs are coming through or not, and that will tell you whether your treatment may need to be repeated or not. But overall, it appears to be less imperative or it doesn't matter quite so much which product you use for the housing treatment if you just want good live weight gains. And one of the explanations for this is that, as I mentioned previously, that it's basically the adult liver fluke in cattle which cause the damage. The young ones, which are when they're wandering through the liver, unlike in sheep, they don't seem to cause much of a problem in cattle, so you don't normally get much of a penalty in performance over those first 8 weeks or so when the fluke are quite young. On the other hand, if you have got adult cattle, for example, that are going to go out the following year and you want to clean them out of fluke entirely, then you have to be it's a little bit more difficult. Again, if you use a triclopyr fascinates type product orally, and if you just delay treatment for a week or two after they've been housed, and then treat, that should be enough to get rid of all the fluke for the rest of the season, and they will go out the following spring without fluke. On the other hand, if you're treating it with one of the other products, there may be some juvenile fluke which will survive that first treatment if you treat them at housing, and in those cases you may need to retreat them, generally speaking, 8 to 12 weeks later when any fluke which have been missed, if you like, by that first treatment will have matured to become adult fluke and be susceptible. And so that's really the approach for the Trodax or closamectin type products, or for the porons which contain triclopyr. And if they're any adults like Zanil or Ivermectin super or those kind of things, albumin, then they may need to be retreated about 12 weeks after the animals have been housed. There is another option which carries a slight risk with it, and that is rather than treat them twice, you actually just delay that first treatment until the animals have been housed for 8 to 12 weeks, and then you know that all the liver fluke inside them are adults, and therefore they will be killed essentially by any of the products you use. The slight risk in that is that obviously they will be for 2 to 3 months, they will not have any treatment, and if they have big liver fluke burdens in them, then of course they will suffer some poor performance during that delay in treatment. So that needs to be weighed up, and that can be done again in consultation with your vet or your SQP, and also through your own monitoring in terms of live weight and all the rest of it. So those are the sort of options. I think, as I say, we sometimes overcomplicate this a little bit, but you can get good control with the housing treatment with virtually anything in terms of live weight gain, but if you want them clean, then you may need to either delay treatment or repeat treatment, in summary. So we'll just move on now to the lice and the mange mites. These are what we call obligate parasites. That is to say that they do not survive off the animal for any length of time. They rely on the animal to feed and to breed, to reproduce. And so effective treatment should give you a very high rate of control because, as I say, they don't sort of survive in the straw, at least not for any length of time, and normally speaking, not to an extent which is going to cause reinfestations. With external parasites, we're restricted to basically two groups of products. One is called the pyrethroids. That's products which contain synthetic pyrethroids. Examples are Butox or Dissect or Flypore, for example. Some of these kill lice. One of them will kill lice and mange mites. That's Flypore, and they can be used if control of lice, particularly, or lice and mange, is the main objective of your housing treatment. The other group we've already come across, and that's the so-called MLs or avermectins. So in other words, again, we've got epinexide, dexamethasone, those kind of products. And they're available as porons or injectables in most cases. And they, particularly the porons, are effective against both lice and most sorts of mange, not all sorts of mange. And so they are the alternative. And I guess it's immediately clear that the avermectins therefore sort of cover a multitude of parasites at housing, and it probably explains why they are quite popular products to use at this time, because they do cover such a wide range. But nevertheless, if you're not trying to control other parasites for any reason, particularly perhaps in older animals rather than sort of youngsters, young calves or yearlings, then you can certainly use a straightforward pyrethroid just to control the externals by themselves. The secret of successful treatment for ectoparasites, at least as much as we know, is number one is to use the appropriate product again, and that is self-evident, I guess, but it needs to be reminded. And because one of the mange types, which is difficult to cure, fortunately, at the moment is quite uncommon, broadly speaking, you can get good control of the other common sorts of mange and the common lice through using topical avermectin type product, or Flypore in particular if it's for mange and lice. If it's just for lice, then either of the other two pyrethroid type products. Injectable MLs, just a quick note, are effective against some mange mites and some lice, but not all. And therefore, if you want, complete control of the different sorts, then you probably need to go for a topical, a poron, rather than an injectable. You should, obviously, there's all the standard things like treating it to the correct dose and all the rest of it, which needs to be followed as with any veterinary treatment. In the case of external parasites, do make sure you treat all the animals in the group at the same time. These are quite contagious parasites, and they can and do spread from one animal to the other. And if you have untreated animals in the same group as treated animals, or if you have untreated animals in the next door pen, but they can contact the other animals, then you will get, or you can get, reinfection. So that's important. You should treat them all at the same time and any in contact at the same time. And as a final point, particularly relevant to lice probably, is that look at the nutrition. Lice are often associated with poor nutrition, so if the nutrition is poor, that should be improved as well as a sort of a backup support for the actual treatment of the lice themselves. Now, it will be obvious from what we've just said that no single treatment probably will kill everything, and hence there are combination products around. These are typically mixtures of flukicides and worm products, and also kill the stomach worms, the gut worms, plus the liver fluke, because the liver fluke products tend to be completely different from the other ones. They're obviously convenient. They're not. None of them are probably perfect. None is a complete answer to everything, but they certainly have a role, and they are particularly useful around housing time, where you are actually trying to target a whole range of different parasites. So it makes sense to try and use as few products as possible to do that. But having said that, a lot of farmers may, for example, use a topical treatment for external parasites, an injectable for liver fluke, or a topical which will kill both the externals and the gut worms and lungworms, plus a flukicide. So there are various options other than, or including combinations, which can be used to cover all the parasites you want. I think just to finish off with, we obviously live in an age when, for all sorts of reasons, there's a lot of focus on responsible use of veterinary medicines on farm, particularly antibiotics and antiparasitics. And clearly, this is no exception at the housing treatment. So you do try and make sure you're using the correct product for the correct parasite. Administer correctly, of course, means calibrating your dosing equipment and all that sort of stuff. Plus, if you do have a weigh scale, please use it, because all these products are given according to a body weight basis. And if you don't weigh your animals, you can't possibly dose accurately. And I know that might sound a little bit impractical, but really, I would encourage all farmers, if you haven't got one, to try to get a weigh scale. It'll more than pay for itself in less than a year, just to get more accurate dosing, more close monitoring of live weights. And you're responsible, the vet's responsible, your suppliers are responsible to try and keep this online so that we're able to control these parasites effectively. I think that's it for now. I just the success of parasite control, I think, rests on accurate diagnosis and monitoring, using the proper drugs, using them correctly in terms of the equipment. Obviously, they need to be cost-effective to make sense in a farming context. And convenience is an altar to which we all probably worship. And that's important, but equally, there may be times where you have to make life a bit difficult for yourself to get the right treatment. So that's all for that section. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah. Okay, Andy, thanks very much. I'm glad you did give us that little bit at the end there about correct dosing applications and so on, because it's certainly an issue we've promoted a lot in the sheep industry in terms of making sure dosing guns are calibrated and that you weigh the animals and dose appropriately to the heaviest in the group. And I wasn't so sure if it was such a strong message in cattle, but I think from what you're saying it is.
Absolutely, yeah.
You mentioned the Parasite product guide at the beginning of that second session. Just to remind everybody that is available on the website. Our website now is beefandlamb.ahdb.org.uk, or just Google AHDB beef and we'll come up. You'll find the Parasite product guide is in the health and fertility section of the Better Returns program area. When you'll see a list of all the publications there, including the Beef Diseases Directory and the Controlling Worms and Liver Fluke manual. But the Parasite product guide is at the bottom of that list under the generic publications at the bottom, because it includes all the sheep internal and external parasite products as well. And as Andy said, it's updated every year, and it is a very comprehensive list of all the products that you can purchase. Andy, just a question that's come in regarding spring and autumn herds. So would you consider any different advice in terms of treatments between a spring or an autumn calving herd? I think that's probably still in the context of at housing time.
No, I think actually at housing, I think you would tend to treat the animals. I mean, clearly, if we just deal with both spring calving beef herd, assuming the calves are weaned either late summer, early autumn, or maybe even not weaned until they're housed, but irrespective, they would require a housing dose. They would be the class of stock which would be quite susceptible to gutworms in particular, and lungworms possibly on some farms. And although it's not, again, quite so common because of their sort of the fact they're with their mothers and on a milk diet for at least some of their first grazing season, they can indeed pick up liver fluke as well, especially towards the end, especially if they've been weaned. So all in all, weaned calves from a spring calving setup, would fall straight into the category we've been talking about animals which would benefit from a housing treatment. The autumn calves clearly depends on, clearly if they're calving after housing or just before housing, the calves themselves would be too young to justify any treatments at all, and you would then focus your control of those calves the following year when they're out grazing. And again, you would obviously do a housing treatment in their second year. Well, at least they're kind of halfway through their second year, as it were. The end of their first year,
there was a further question on liver fluke, and the question was basically, will one treatment for liver fluke at housing be sufficient for the whole winter? And I think there was an interesting session there in your talk about whether, obviously, if they're finishing cattle and they're not going out, then your target is to aim at the adult cattle, so one dose at the beginning. But if they're cattle that are going back out, you might consider the sort of immature liver fluke, the fluke that are immature at the point of housing, and consider a second treatment later in the spring before turnout. Is that basically the gist?
Yeah, that's exactly the gist. As I say, it's surprising that for what is a very common practice, there's actually not a huge amount of research that's been done to look at the various options and how best to use them. And some of this is based on trial work, but as I say, not very much. And some is just based on the actual knowledge of the parasite and knowledge of the products and what they do. But in essence, you've summarised it very well. If you've got animals coming in to be fattened and they're not going to go out to graze again, probably the best thing is to treat them at housing. But it may not be. You can probably treat them with virtually any of the flucicides, and you should ensure good growth rates at least for the next couple of months after they're housed. If for any reason growth rates start to slip after that, which you can do by monitoring, then it may mean that they've carried some immature burdens at the same time as housing, and that they've now matured into adults, and they may need to be retreated. But that I would suggest you can manage by monitoring their growth rates. If the growth rates are where you want them to be, then they're probably no need to do anything. If they're slipping, then that may well be an indication that they need to be treated again. And again, you could ask your vet to take some samples just to sort of check if that is the case. And otherwise, as you say, if you definitely want them completely free of fluke at the end of the winter, then either delay the treatment or perhaps a better practice would be to treat them, but then retreat 2 or 3 months after housing. Or anyway, before they go out to the following year at some stage.
Yeah. Just a question regarding, we're talking about treatments at housing, but for cattle that are outwintered, that's possibly a bigger topic and one for another day, but are there any sort of quick tips that producers could think about for those that are outwintered?
You're right. It is almost a topic for another day, but the difficulty there, of course, is, or at least what makes it different from housing, is quite obviously that they may be still picking up infection from the pasture more or less throughout the winter. Although some of these larvae and things decline over the winter, they're not usually completely absent, and therefore if the cattle are grazing on ground where there may still be larvae or whatever in the herbage, and they are eating enough herbage to get a decent, they may still become reinfected. So, for example, with liver fluke, you would probably recommend a treatment in the autumn, say October time, but probably to repeat that, say, around January time, because they clearly may be being reinfected over the intervening period. With the gut worms, it's a little bit less straightforward, but you probably wouldn't necessarily treat them as early as October. You might get away with a single treatment again around Christmas, New Year time to avoid these inhibited dormant larvae, which at that stage will not have started to resume development. So you might get away with a single treatment there. Although if they're younger cattle, you might want to do it a couple of times, same sort of thing, October and say January time.
One final question, coming back to the external parasites in terms of mange and lice. If we've treated at housing, is that it for winter? Do we consider that's an effective kill of everything? If we treat all of the cattle as you advised us? Yeah,
I mean, as I say, so long as there's no cross-infection between untreated cattle and treated ones, in other words, if the treated ones are treated effectively and kept as a sort of within the same group and not mixed with anything else, then not theoretically, I mean, practically speaking, that should be it. You shouldn't have to retreat them. And this is a thing which is again, one of the reasons why housing treatments I think are deservedly popular for controlling externals, because you shouldn't ever get the problem. If it doesn't work, it may be that the original treatments weren't done correctly. In other words, they were perhaps underdosed or something like that, or some animals were missed, or it may mean that there's been some transfer between untreated and treated animals, which might occur, by accident or by getting loose, or maybe handling them or something, and they just didn't sort of realize that there was a chance of cross infections. But fundamentally, yes, a properly applied housing treatment should lead to essentially no lice problems for the rest of the winter.
Just one sort of caveat on that, and if we're unable to house everything all at once, but they're all going into the same sort of location, airspace, and so on, is there a persistency? So if I'm housing one batch of cattle today, but I won't get the next one in for a week, is there a persistency if I treat those that I brought in today, or am I better off waiting until everything's in and then doing the treatment when everything's in?
Some of the products do have persistent activity. All the pyrethroid products do, and one of the abamectin type products has a claim for persistent activity. And so, yes, precisely that. If it's a short interval between different batches being treated, I mean, the persistence is actually quite long. It's several weeks. So in theory, you could treat animal over a period of several weeks. But I think realistically, and to avoid any bad surprises, if they were being treated within a week or a couple of weeks, that should be sufficient. But again, just check the label, check with your vet or SQP, and just see what these products can do. But that certainly gives you a bit of flexibility on that.
Yeah. Okay, Andy, I think we've kind of run over a little bit on our usual 45 minutes, but thank you very much for the vast amount of detail there. It is a complicated subject.